Hello once again, my friends, it's Nekumore here, and today I'm bringing you a different type of video. Normally I do game commentaries for my web show or, reviews of certain games, but today I'm bringing you a creepypasta, one that I wrote myself. Over the last couple weeks, I've been obsessed with Some Ordinary Gamers' haunted gaming segments that they've been doing, and listening to all these various creepypastas written by other people inspired me to try to write my own. So, without further ado, I present to you Super Metroid. Rest in peace. I was driving home from a funeral, following my friend's mother to their house. This didn't feel real. It's a day that will stick with me for years. Today, we buried one of my closest friends. His name was Brandon, and nobody really knows how he died. It was hard enough being there at the service, but seeing his friends and family there made it so much worse. I didn't know what to say to any of them. His death had been so sudden. The only conversation we had was his mother, who wanted me to follow her home to pick some things up. As we pulled up to the house, the usual air of hype and excitement had all but disappeared, replaced now by a very heavy emptiness. It took me a little longer than normal to get out of my car. I knew I wouldn't see his stupid face peering from his window, waiting for me to come up. I didn't even look. I couldn't. Finally mustering up the strength to get out of his car, I walked up to the porch with his mother. She unlocked the door and we walked in. I removed my shoes and went up to his room. The hallway seemed longer and colder than it did before. At the end of the hall was his room. Brandon's door was shut and I instinctively knocked, expecting to hear him call at me to come in. I opened the door and found a rather large box on his bed. As I was inspecting the box, wondering how I was going to fit it into my car, his mother walked into the room, biting her thumbnail. "This is a bunch of his stuff. I figured you'd want it." Tears welled up in my eyes and I nodded, thanking her for it. She helped me carry it down to my car. The box surprisingly fit into my little trunk. With one last hug and a goodbye, I was off, returning to my apartment some half-hour away. It's been a few weeks since I last visited Brandon's home. I never ended up taking the box out of my trunk. Eventually, though, I found myself needing to clear my trunk out for various errands that needed to be done. I struggled to get the box out of the trunk, and it did eventually come free. I brought it inside and set it down on the coffee table in my living room. I should go through this, I thought to myself. I decided against it for the time being and head off to make dinner and get ready to go out with some friends. A couple hours later, I found myself walking up to a house party with my friends. The music was so loud, I was surprised that anyone had heard us ringing the doorbell. Someone eventually did come and welcomed us inside. I felt a little better. I'd been so distant from people since Brandon's death, it was nice to be around people again. After mingling for some time, I decided to head back towards the kitchen to refill my drink. I squeezed by people and passed through the living room. As I passed the TV, I heard a familiar voice call my name. It sent a chill up my spine, and I dropped my glass. It shattered on the hardwood floor. I was embarrassed, but glancing around, I expected people to be staring at me, but strangely nobody was. It was like they didn't notice. I heard the voice call to me again. The music in the background seemed to muffle out and fade away into the distance. The voice belonged to Brandon. I knew it did, but where was it coming from? Looking around the room, my eyes finally rested on the TV, where again, Brandon had called to me. The TV turned on, displaying an audible static, but through the static, Brandon's voice echoed. I couldn't believe it. Looking around again, I confirmed that nobody had noticed the shattered cup, or that I was so closely inspecting the TV. "Brandon?" I called softly. He responded. It really was him. My chest felt so heavy. I sat down in front of the TV and spoke with him for what felt like hours. We talked about so many things. He asked me if I'd gone through it yet. I asked him what he meant. All he said back was, "Box." Did he mean his things? "No, not yet. It's been really difficult," I responded. We went silent for a bit. I finally decided to ask the question that's been hanging on my mind. "Brandon, how did you die?" I listened intently, needing to know the answer, needing the closure. Suddenly, a loud beeping started echoing in the distance. My alarm clock, I thought to myself. My alarm clock? I woke up with a bit of a start. Taking a moment to fully wake up, I turned my alarm clock off and looked around my room. It had been a dream. I don't remember going to bed, or even when I'd gotten home. I guess I was so overcome with stress that my mind made up the conversation with Brandon to try to ease it. Maybe. Either way, I thought, I need to get out of bed. The box sat on the table in the living room. Eyeing it over, I thought about what Brandon had asked me, if I had been through it yet. Well, I hadn't. Today was as good a day as ever. It was only a little after noon, so I had all day to go through it. I got myself a drink from the kitchen and made my way into the living room. Sitting on the couch beside the table, I let out a long exhale. Here we go, I thought. Pulling the box open, I peer inside. Scanning my eyes from item to item, I started pulling things out. There were some shirts, a couple of crappy horror movies, and a binder. Opening the binder, I saw that it was a ridiculously large collection of some trading card game. I chuckled a little. For as long as I knew Brandon, I never pictured him as the type to be into collectible card games like that. Setting the binder aside, I continued pulling out various things until I saw something that caught my eye. The familiar gray plastic of a Super Nintendo lay buried underneath some more stuff. Man, the last time I touched a Super Nintendo was when I was much younger. I pulled out the system and underneath I saw a bunch of games. I was now feeling a strange mix of feelings. It's really hard to describe. I was happy that Brandon's mother had given me this, as it was something that he had cherished dearly, but I was also sad knowing that I'd never again get to hear about his adventure through some of his favorite games. I started to pull out the games. He had one favorite game that he had played all the time, and it was sitting at the bottom of the stack. Super Metroid. I pulled the game out and set the box aside. Truth be told, I did have some experience with some of the later Metroid games, but I had never really played the classics. I put the cartridge into the Super Nintendo and looked through the box for the cables and the controller. Getting everything set up into my television, I turned on a nearby lamp, flicked on the Super Nintendo, and got comfortable on the couch. It was time to play Super Metroid. Loading up the game, I saw that there was only one lone save file to slot A. I thought about diving into his file to see where he was and what he had, but I didn't want anything spoiled for me. Not yet, anyway. So without a second thought, I started a file on slot B. Before long, I found myself immersed in the story as told by Samus Aran. She told me about her history and brought me up to speed with what had happened before this game took place. One of the first things I noticed was how blue the space station was. As I tried to progress, my lack of skill with the controls made it look like Samus was actually fumbling around in the darkness, which I suppose was appropriate. As the hours started to pass, I found myself a fair ways into the game. Samus had been decked out with the morph ball, bombs, missiles, the high jump, the Varia suit, a couple of beam upgrades, and a variety of energy tanks and missile tanks. I could see why Brandon had loved this game so much. It's massive, with a lot of exploration, and it played on subtle fears. Well, for me at least. The concept of alien worlds and venturing into the dark unknown spooked me a little for some reason. I got up to get another drink and maybe a snack. Returning to the living room with refreshments, I looked the console over. Curiosity was getting the better of me. I wanted to see what Brandon's file looked like. No doubt he had everything there was to find in the game. Seeing some of these items or abilities may add to the excitement of the game for me. You know, give me something to look forward to. I reset the game and loaded up File A. The music that plays when Samus appears into the save room played, but something seemed off. The area's music was playing like normal, but Samus wasn't there on screen. And the energy meter was dropping rapidly. He didn't have a single energy tank. As Samus's health ticked away, I thought to myself that it was just a glitch, and I reset the game. Loading up File A again, the same thing happened. Weird, I thought to myself. I let Samus's health deplete, and when she died, the screen simply went black. There wasn't the normal sound effect or visual of her suit exploding off of her. The Game Over screen showed up, but instead of the usual return to game and go to title, the text read, "Rest in Peace," where go to title should have been. I couldn't pull the cursor off of Rest in Peace, regardless of which buttons I'd pressed. Seeing Rest in Peace made me feel a little uneasy. I had died several times in game, but never once saw Rest in Peace. Maybe it was some kind of hardcore mode. You know, like an insanely hard difficulty? I didn't know. I reset the game and loaded my save file. Everything seemed to be working just fine. I had left off in Norfair, where I had been exploring and looking for additional pickups for my arsenal. Running around the sweltering environment, the corridors and caves lit only by the glow of the lava, I began to notice something strange. Whenever I popped a bubble door to move on to the next room, it would close behind me like normal, but just as it would scroll off screen, I would hear it open again. There were a few instances where I briefly saw the door open. When I turned around to investigate, the door was wide open, though nothing was there. Another glitch, maybe? We are talking about a cartridge from decades ago. I wouldn't be surprised if it wasn't working properly. I decided to experiment with the glitched bubble doors. I left the room, then came back in, letting the door just barely scroll off screen and stopped immediately. Sure enough, it popped back open. But this time, I saw something leave the room. A dark mass of pixels seemed to quickly make its way out as the door opened. Maybe it wasn't a glitch. Perhaps it's something programmed into the game, I thought to myself. I gave chase, expecting to find something on the other side of the door. The next room over was a dim hallway, and standing in between me and the far door was the dark mass of pixels that I briefly saw. The mass itself was transparent, at least enough to see the background, but not enough to be easily overlooked. Thinking that it was a new enemy, I decided to try blasting it with my ice beam. The beam itself seemed to phase right through this thing. I tried a few missiles, but to no avail. I noticed that there seemed to be a face in this max of pixels looking at me, instead of paying attention to Samus. Perhaps it's just my mind putting a face where there really isn't one, but I couldn't help feeling like I was being watched. The air around me started to feel rather cold, which was unusual for an evening in the middle of July. Unsure of what else to do, I decided to run into it to see if it was any sort of threat. For all I knew, it could have been a friendly creature. As Samus passed through the mass, it appeared to absorb itself into Samus' suit. The low health siren started to go off, and I panicked. My health was dropping as quickly as it had on Brandon's file. I pushed every button on the controller and even stood up, shaking it, thinking it would do something. The screen went black as Samus let out her last breath. Her suit flashed and exploded as it ran out of energy. Game over. I felt the color drain from my face as I looked over my options. Rest in peace. I couldn't believe what I saw. Why now? Why did the game change now? I was able to choose return to game this time. Strangely enough, I was not able to choose rest in peace. Reluctantly, I pushed the start button, and the game loaded up just like normal, except that I was missing an energy tank. Before I had saved and reset, I had 4 energy tanks, but now I only have 3. I started off back in the save room. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I didn't know what to do, so I decided to call it a night. I got up to go turn the Super Nintendo off. Click. I went to take the game out of the system, but I recoiled as soon as I had touched it. The game was incredibly hot to the touch. I stuck my finger in my mouth trying to cool it down. Thinking quickly, I pulled the Super Nintendo's power cord out of the back. How long had it been hot like this? If it was overheating like this, then it's no wonder things were getting a little screwy, I said to myself. Looking at my reflection in the TV, I noticed that there was someone or something standing behind my couch, staring at me. It appeared to be the same dark mass that I had seen in the game. Startled, I quickly looked to see who was intruding this late in the evening, but there was no one there. I looked back at the TV and saw nothing. I attributed this as a result of a traumatic experience and exhaustion. At least that's what I told myself, so that I wouldn't panic further. Little sleep was had that night. I kept thinking I was hearing noises throughout the apartment. It started out with light scratches against walls or the ceiling of my bedroom. Sometimes I thought I'd hear breathing. It would stop for a little bit, but then it would just start right up again. Looking at my clock, it was a little after 2 in the morning. I groaned, my inability to fall asleep more frustrating than anything else. I sat up in bed with the intention of going to use the bathroom. As I came back from the bathroom, I shut my bedroom door and made my way back to my bed. As I kneeled on my bed to climb back in, the bedroom door flung wide open and slammed into my wall with a crash. I jumped, and then remained still. The door was shut. I shut that. I know I did. Looking towards my door, I let out a stifled gasp. Standing just outside in the kitchen was a dark figure, and even though it did not have solid bodily features, I could tell that there was a face, and it was staring me down. I was paralyzed with fear for a moment. It appeared like it was starting to slowly move towards me. I jumped out of bed, yelling, "No, no, 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 no!" I shut the door, and just as I did, the mass slammed against it. I clicked the door lock and stood back as this thing continued to bash against the door. Without a second thought, I quickly began to turn on some lights. I looked at the windows, thinking I could climb out of them. Moving my dresser away from the windows, I started to unlock them when I heard it. Silence. I didn't hear anything. Whatever that mass was had stopped attacking my door. I was afraid to turn around. I knew that it would be standing right behind me. It took a moment or two to build up the courage to turn around, and when I finally did, my door was wide open. The dark mass was nowhere to be found. I went to the door and poked my head out. Nothing. I couldn't see anything unusual. I clicked the light on and investigated the rest of the apartment. Nothing. Was it just some gnarly dream? My eyes fell onto the Super Nintendo. I carefully touched the Super Metroid cartridge and found that it was perfectly cool to the touch. For a moment, I considered playing the game some more. I mean, I wasn't going to be going to sleep anytime soon. Any smart person would have disposed of the game that could scare someone this easily. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, that I am not a smart person. I turn on as many lights as I can and decide to continue playing Super Metroid. The game loaded up like normal. I was still missing that energy tank. Wondering what the significance could be, I decided to leave Norfair. As I navigated the corridors, I couldn't help but feel a little afraid of the thought of running into the dark mass again. Eventually, I found the boss lair of Crocomire. As I fought this giant creature, the events of the night seemed to slip from my mind. I found myself having fun again. As I dealt the final blow to knock Crocomire into the lava pit, I felt a great sense of accomplishment. As I left, Crocomyre's skeletal return had startled me, but seeing that he was harmless, I let out a sigh of relief. I popped the bubble door to move on. Within moments of progressing through the room, I heard the bubble door pop open again. I stood up from the couch quickly, remembering that this is how it all started yesterday. Setting the controller down, I rest my hand on the cartridge. It wasn't hot at all. I picked up the controller again and went to check the door. It was open. "Oh, hell no," I said aloud. I made Samus run in the opposite direction as quickly as I could. Making my way through the rooms, I eventually picked up the grapple beam, an item that would help Samus maneuver around a little easier. And then, finally, I found one. A save room. I saved the game, and just as the text box went away, the Super Nintendo had lost power. The screen filled with an eerie static, much like when I had last spoken with Brandon in my dream. I pinched myself really hard and it hurt like hell. I wasn't dreaming this time. I heard Brandon call out from the static again. "Brandon!" I shouted. He seemed surprised to hear me call for him. I asked him what was wrong with his Super Metroid game. He asked me if I was playing it. I responded, yes, and he started laughing. But something was wrong. His voice seemed to be changing. Hearing this shift in his voice was chilling. He finally stopped, and all sound became muffled, seemingly falling back into the distance. Brandon's deep, distorted voice echoed in my head. "Rest in peace." It wasn't Brandon. Whoever was talking to me isn't Brandon. The television loses power, and in the reflection once again, I can see the figure standing behind me. But this time, he was bent over, mere inches from my face. Startled, I turned to look behind me. Nothing. I saw nothing. But when I turned back around to look at the TV's reflection again, I noticed that the room was much brighter. It was daytime. I could hear my alarm going off in the other room. I blinked, confused as to what had just happened. It had only been a little after 4 a.m. before the game started acting up again. I went into my bedroom to turn the clock off. It read 12:15 p.m. I was stunned. Just like that, 8 hours of my life had just disappeared. I paced around my living room wondering what I should do. I can't keep playing this game. There is something seriously wrong here. My door being thrown open by a dark figure that I had seen in the video game, seeing this thing in my reflection twice now, sitting in place for 8 hours without a single memory of that entire time. I looked over at the Super Nintendo. I shook my head in disbelief. I couldn't believe I was regretting going back to my friend's house after his funeral. Frustrated, I left the living room to go get ready for my day. I had a plethora of errands to run today. As I made my way through town, I could not shake the feeling that I was being followed. You know that feeling when somebody walks too closely behind you? That was all I could feel, even though I knew no one was behind me. As I walked around, every dog I would pass seemed to cower behind their owner and bark at me like I was some kind of threat. The owners would give me strange looks. It was like some cliched horror movie. I sighed, wondering when my torment would end. Hours passed. I was back at home getting ready for bed. The stress of the previous days had finally started to get to me. I laid in bed and quickly fell asleep. I heard the sound of Samus's beam blasting through bubble doors and monsters alike. I opened my eyes and hazily looked around my room. Brinstar's music could be heard in the background. Sure enough, somebody was playing Super Metroid. I jumped out of bed and ran to the living room. As soon as I entered the room, I heard the controller hit the floor just by the couch. Sure enough, Super Metroid was playing itself. Or something was playing the game. Either way, this wasn't going to end until I just beat the game. That much appeared clear. I mean, I could simply just unplug the console, but who was to say that that alone would stop all this? I didn't want to risk that. I was afraid to know what terrors I would have unleashed on me tonight, but I swallowed my fear and picked up the controller. I found myself in Red Brinstar. Samus would no longer act without my input, so I began exploring. The game seemed to play normally, though I noticed the enemies would either not spawn or seem to stay away from me. All I could think about was how the dogs treated me earlier. I guess they could all tell I was a dead man walking. As I made my way through the halls and climbed the steep hills, I felt a distinct sense of dread looming over me. It's a little ironic that the lack of danger in the game made me feel uneasy, but not having to defend myself from the planet's many creatures felt like the calm before the storm. It was a little while before I felt the need to check my health. Another energy tank was missing. I was down to 2. Shivering, I noticed a drop of temperature around me. The hairs on my arms stood on end. The doors would start opening behind me again. Here we go, I thought to myself. This time, after a door would reopen, I would see the dark mass rush at Samus, then disappear just before catching her. As it moved, I heard footsteps rushing right at me. Not in the game, though, in my living room. I looked around but saw nobody. Each time I went into a new room, I would see something charge at Samus and hear it run at me outside the game again. The sounds would always stop as soon as it disappeared off the screen. With all this happening, I realized that I had no clue where I was in the game. The map helped a little bit, but even with it, I still felt lost. I began to sweat, wondering when whatever was haunting me was going to attack. Eventually, I found myself alone again. The masses had stopped. Everything was quiet. The silence was deafening. Before I could even appreciate the calm, every single cabinet door and drawer flew open with a bang. I let out a yelp, staring into the kitchen, trying to see if the mass had manifested itself again. Before I could really deduce anything, I heard the game making a strange sound. It was like the game was moaning under the pressure. Behind Samus, I saw many of the black masses starting to give chase. There was more than one? This wasn't like before. I could tell. They wanted me dead. I snatched up the controller and started to run as fast as I could get Samus to go. There really wasn't enough ground for me to trigger the speed booster. I eventually found myself running through a glass tube. The bubble door on the other side of the hall was locked. They have me, I thought. I'm done for. The door behind me locked. I was trapped. Outside of the glass tube lay a watery environment. Fortunately, it seemed as though the masses couldn't pass through walls. At least I knew they aren't ghosts, I chuckled to myself, thinking that this conclusion would help ease my panic. It didn't. Coming back to my senses, I noticed that the masses started coming on screen from the top and the bottom. No, I thought, they're still gonna get me. They crept closer and closer, moving through the water very slowly. And just when I thought they were about to catch me, they stopped, pressed against the glass tube. I started laughing out of sheer panic. I couldn't believe it. This was perfect. These things were stuck. I mean, so was I, but, still. I felt myself trash-talking the masses, forgetting that it was them haunting me, not the other way around. Feeling a little cocky, I decided to place a power bomb. I wanted to imagine that it would vaporize them to hell and back. What I didn't know was that the power bomb would shatter the glass tube I was standing in. It exploded, and the tube started to crack. My face fell as I quickly understood what exactly I had done. The tube shattered, and Samus was overwhelmed by the masses. Her health dropped to 0, and once again, her suit exploded off of her. Just as the screen faded away, every single window in my apartment seemed to explode. Glass shattered and flew everywhere. I was too close to my living room windows and felt the shards of broken glass cut my arms and the side of my neck. The gashes weren't bad, but there was blood flowing from my wounds. I was stunned. Did this really just happen? Unsure of what else to do, I decided to get into my car and drive to the local urgent care. I was gonna need stitches. As I got into my car, I felt like someone had followed me in. My heart was still gripped by fear. Ignoring these feelings, though, I sped off to get my wounds treated. It wasn't easy explaining what had happened. Saying I had fallen through a window sufficed, but that followed up with questions about substance abuse. It was more annoying than anything. More time had passed. It was the following morning, and I sit at my counter, examining my fresh stitches. What do I do? I had so many questions. I needed an answer. Any answer. I pulled over my home phone. I dialed Brandon's house. His mother answered. Yes, good. We spoke for a few moments, exchanging the idle small talk that we normally would. I knew it wasn't going to be easy, but I just had to ask. Did Brandon act strangely before he died? There was a long silence before she answered. Yeah, he'd suffered from regular night terrors. He would constantly wake me up, telling me that there was somebody in his room, watching him sleep. I'd always check, but I never found anything. I told him he was too old for the monster under the bed routine. My heart sank. He was being stalked by someone, or something, too. And just before he died, I looked over at the Super Nintendo. Whatever was stalking him was stalking me now. It was going to kill me. I'm next. Are you alright? His mother's voice brought me back to my senses. Yes, I'm alright. Just thinking about a lot. I didn't want to tell her that whatever killed her son was coming after me. She'd think I'm insane. I just worry because you're breathing really heavily. I was? No, I was barely breathing. I didn't know what she was talking about. What do you mean? I asked, and the line fell silent. It sounded like the call was dropped. I looked at the phone and hung up. Heavy breathing? I got up and went back to the living room. Still certain that I needed to beat the game to solve this, I turned on the console. I loaded my save file, and I let out a gasp. Something had finally just occurred to me. I only had one energy tank left. It was a counter. Every time something significant happened, I'd lose an energy tank. It wasn't that Brandon hadn't gotten any tanks. His timer ran out, and now my timer was almost up, and I had no idea how to handle this situation. In a blind panic, I shut the game off immediately, took it out of the system, unhooked everything, put the Super Nintendo back in the box, and went outside with the game. I smashed the game to pieces with a hammer from the trunk of my car. The plastic pieces flew all over the parking lot. I must have looked crazy, smashing something to bits in the middle of the day, but I could not think of any other way to stop this. Panting heavily, I dropped the hammer onto the ground next to the pieces of the game and went inside. I sat back at my counter, my stitched wounds throbbing in pain and my chest tight. My phone rang. I considered letting it go to voicemail, but answered with a very weak, "Hello?" It was Brandon's mother. "What's wrong? You sound terrible," she said worriedly. I told her that I'd been having a hell of a week, and that I felt like it was gonna get better. She laughed. I was confused, though. "What made you call me?" She didn't answer. "Hello?" She started laughing again. I sat there in stunned silence as her voice twisted into a raspy, eerie voice. Whoever or whatever it was on the line said one last thing before the line went dead. Rest in peace. Thank you guys so much for sticking around for Super Metroid Rest in Peace. Like I said at the beginning of the video, this is my first creepypasta I've ever written, and it was a lot of fun to do. Now, some of the things that went into the writing. The first thing I knew I wanted to do is I wanted to find a way that wasn't so cliche to tell the story, and by that I mean a lot of creepypastas are just, the games are just randomly found, or the games are bought at a used game store, or it's given by an old man, which that is a kind of a cliche that Sog puts on, or Mudahar? Me Mudahar? Mudahar? No, not me Mudahar. He Mudahar. Whatever. The other thing... So I wanted the acquisition of the game to be something a little unique, and in doing so, I managed to write one of the most heartbreaking things ever, apparently. I also wanted the actual happening, the events that take place with the game, to be more than just creepy ongoings inside of the video game. Like, a lot of creepypastas could be completely just brushed away, could be completely circumvented if the person in the pasta would just shut the game off and go on and do something else. Now, obviously, not all pastas, not all the creepypastas, but I wanted to make sure that whatever happened to the main character in the game stuck with him even when he wasn't playing the game, and somehow I wrote it so that the game started playing itself. And obviously it's laughable and unrealistic, and a lot of the things that happened in my creepypasta can't happen normally, but that's like the fun of it. That's the point of writing these stories, right? They're just ridiculous things that couldn't actually happen in real life. But either way, thank you guys so much for sticking around. If you'd like to see more from me in the future, I normally do game reviews or game commentaries for my web show. Subscribe to Nekumore. I don't know why I pointed up when it's down. I don't know which side it is, though. It's mirrored, so it's going to be here. 10 points to me? Yes? No? I don't know. Consider subscribing to Nekumore. I upload once or twice a month if I'm working on my show. Otherwise, I upload whenever I get a video done. Like the video, share the video, and most importantly, comment below and let me know what you thought of my creepypasta. Could it be improved? Well, obviously it can be improved. All writing could be improved. But either way, thank you guys so much for watching again, and I will catch you in the next video. I need to work on my outro, I guess.